Greetings, everyone. I'm Maureen. Welcome to the discussion surrounding Mirna Kostash's extremely unique piece titled Inside the Copper Mountain. My first encounter with Kostash was as a young student at the U of A studying Canadian history, where I had to present an article by Kostash about Ukrainian immigration to the West. So seeing her name in this course gave me many flashbacks to the University of Alberta's small, stuffy seminar classrooms in the Tory building and the smell of the very stifling Rutherford Library, but also the very quasi-Ukrainian heritage I feel because of where I'm from and who I'm married to. Northern Alberta, especially the Edmonton area, if you did not know this, is extremely Ukrainian. I grew up, I think, almost feeling left out because I didn't have a baba to make me homemade pierogies. Don't worry, I married into it. But I think Mirna Kostash has always pulled at my Edmonton heartstrings. And as a fellow Edmontonian and U of A alumni, that obviously helps. But her topic matter, I think, just speaks to the potato-eating prairie Albertan in me, and I like it. But I also really like the way she goes about exploring Vasyl Stüss. It also really speaks, I think, to the historian in me. History was my first love, but I think it's really the second syllable, the story, that I fell in love with. Kostash, as she says, drags him now into her language, her purpose, and her memory. Ultimately, she treats him like a lost love. She kisses her two fingers and lays them on his cheek on the photograph that hangs on her wall, which is a description that I love. It just sits alone on one line on the page, so you can really appreciate it. And I really do. I love that line. It's very simple, but it says so much. This man is Vasyl Stüss, a Ukrainian hero and poet, but ultimately a dissident against the repressive Soviet regime who died in the Russian gulags, the zone, near Copper Mountain in the Urals, where copper mining obviously was prevalent. Vasyl Stüss is very much a Ukrainian hero today, even. There are streets and currency that bear his name. A train station in Kiev was just recently renamed after him, after its current name was rejected because of its Russian ties. Given the current situation in Ukraine, you can understand the desire for the rename, which begs the question of, I can only imagine what Vasyl Stüss would have thought today about Vladimir Putin and most definitely Donald Trump. If he had social media today, what would Vasyl Stüss have said about the events in the White House on Friday? I think Kostash could imagine that wonderfully for us. And imagining details, I think, is exactly what she did in this piece of writing. She takes history, in my mind, out of the very stifling Tory seminar rooms and the Rutherford Library and puts it into this nice, bright, open classroom, if you will, with fresh air that's just so full of possibilities. And conveniently is also using italics to differentiate her imaginings from the historical record. She uses M.K. Mikhailina Kotsiubinska as her entry point, who is a friend of Stüss's and a person who provided Kostash access to records and a lot of writings about Vasyl Stüss. And because they share initials, in Kostash's mind, they share a window, I guess, into an identity. And this is a window that Kostash crawls through with great imagination. In fact, this piece of writing is from an entire book of pieces called The Doomed Bridegroom, which is a collection of narrations about Kostash's attractions to Eastern European rebels. She states, quote, "The doomed bridegroom is a revolutionary male on the doomed left who is fated or doomed never to marry or never to marry me." End quote. Poor Mirna, always the mistress. So Vasyl Stüss was a doomed bridegroom, just one of her many imagined love affairs. But all of these were real men, real rebels that she quite clearly had a real attraction to. So let's start there. Kostash imagines herself in many scenes with Stüss, going so far as a steamy beach scene where Stüss, quote, spills into her hand. She describes these scenes with, I find, such realism that it feels like I'm reading a diary entry that she wrote immediately after the event. It feels really real, but it isn't. This ability, though, to kind of time travel throughout history provides so many creative opportunities that she obviously takes, and it can allow the imagination to run in any direction through this kind of fresh air that Kostash has given it. But I think it also really hints at this romantic notion of history that I think we have. I mean, it's what I have. It's why I studied history, so I could imagine myself in it. Kostash romanticizes Stus right from the get-go by kissing his cheek, describing him as a Ukrainian Marlon Brando. And I mean, people love doing this. The Crusades are romanticized by Ridley Scott in The Kingdom of Heaven, and World War II was romanticized by Alistair MacLean in The Guns of Navarone. In each story, when I see them or read them, I learn about time, the events, the people. I get curious and I want to learn more, and it feeds my curiosity. It's fiction that is breeding the nonfiction that I'm consuming. I took an entire course on the history of Christianity, but I can honestly say that I learned more about the topic from the Da Vinci Code than I did from that course, mostly because Dan Brown made me more curious than my professor did. I find academia tends to suffocate the stories of history, and the creativity that could come from that is often lost. Kostash brought Stus's story to life by, I feel, imagining him to life. I learned a ton about Vasyl Stus, Ukrainian dissidents in the Cold War, Russian gulags, certainly more than I did before, despite the fact that I grew up in the heart of Canadian-Ukrainian country. But more importantly, I think I enjoyed learning this information. So does being entertained matter when it comes to learning and being curious? I teach for a living, and often I feel like an entertainer standing in front of a crowd. I think the more entertaining I am, the more I can hold my audience. So should I take creative liberties like Kostash? Should I use nonfiction as my base and inject some fiction for the sake of education? Is there a story from history that you remember well because of its storyteller? I think we all have our favorite historical fiction movies and books. I do anyway. I'm curious as to what are yours. What drove you to maybe dive deeper into history and educate yourself more? What brought history to life to you? I gave a few of my own examples, but I'm curious as to what made you dive deeper. But at the same time, why are we compelled to do this in the first place? What about those time frames make storytellers want to go back and reimagine them or entertain with those stories? What about Vasyl Stus has made Myrna Kostash want to go back and reimagine his life with her? And why him? I could go to the late 1960s in Woodstock, stand backstage next to Janis Joplin. I could go to the late 1940s, 50s, or 60s to hang out with Bruno Engler, hang out at Sunshine Village, and maybe make out with him with Mount Bourgeot in the background. I mean, I love music and Janis Joplin. I love skiing in Sunshine Village. I'm romantic about these people and these places and their history, and I want to experience those things myself. But I can't, just like Kostash couldn't. But if I could. So what about you? That's next question. What if you could? What if you could go back in time? Who would you want to cozy up next to in the annals of history, and why? I mean, imagine away. Make out with Frank Sinatra. Go be a groupie on a Kiss tour if you want. The point is, it's not real. But that is also kind of the rub of this, isn't it? It's not real. It can't be real. I'm not going to go see Janis Joplin side stage or make out with Bruno Engler, just like Kostash did not have a relationship with Vasyl Stus as much as she may have wanted to. In fact, by all accounts, Vasyl Stus was a happily married man. So while well over half of this piece is an accurate portrayal of his life in and out of the Russian Gulag system, sprinkled in are all of these imaginings from Kostash. She takes license with the fact that she cannot find a photo of his wife, using that kind of wee little omission from the historical record to, in a sense, become his mistress. So wondering about the title of this piece, I went down a bit of a rabbit's hole. Kostash chose this title for a reason. Why? She doesn't mention Copper Mountain anywhere. But interestingly enough, there is a Russian fairy tale that is attached to the Copper Mountain titled The Mistress of the Copper Mountain. The mistress was said to favor honest, hardworking people who were brave and freedom-loving, just like Stus. In the fairy tale, a man named Stepan encounters the mistress while mining and does her bidding by asking the mine foreman to stop mining. Delighted, she asks him to marry her. He declines, saying he's already engaged. Impressed by his honesty, the mistress gifts him and his future wife, Nastya, with riches and tells Stepan to forget all about her. But after years of marriage, Stepan cannot forget about the mistress and disappears to find her, only to be found dead by the rocks. Poor Nastya. But looking at this fairy tale, I see some parallels to Stüss and how Kostash portrays him. She talks about the last few months he spent in freedom before going back to the zone as being, quote, cast down and discouraged. She says it was hard for him to breathe in that suffocating atmosphere of the half-truth and the false. Ironically, his disdain for the Russian regime and his ability to express this disdain was best done in the Ural Mountains, watching the men and women slave in the zone, near the Copper Mountain. His mistress, freedom and honesty, kept calling him back. Poor Valentina, who is Vassal's wife. So, what are your thoughts on this comparison? Am I crazy, or is there something to this fairy tale and Vassal Stüss? Is Kostash the mistress? She makes no mention to a Copper Mountain anywhere else in this piece, but she chose it for a reason. So I would really love to hear your thoughts on that. I think I also have to comment on Kostash's just beautiful writing style. She doesn't try to dazzle me with big words or fancy prose. She dazzled me with, I think, her realism. The last imagining we have from Kostash is one of just longing. She gives a beautiful description of want. Quote, "You belong on my white pillows, your limbs smeared with my candle glow, my breath exhaling on your thigh." The way she uses her actions, the breath exhaling, and then her word choice in the smearing candlelight, I'll be honest, it makes me jealous. She just writes with so much passion. And I suppose there's a reason that she is a celebrated Canadian writer. It makes sense. But that after that last entry from MK, the rest of the piece is biographical in nature, using letters and archival material to piece together the last 5 years of Stüss's life. In a sense, there is nothing more to romanticize, no more need for the italics. Stüss spent the last 5 years of his life in the zone where he could scream about freedom and injustice really as loudly as he wanted, because the only people there to hear him were people saying the same things. There's really no more love poems for the mistress to get jealous of, or there's no more passionate pleas for freedom to be inspired by. So no more italics. They disappear. Stüss's material had become entirely the property of the KGB, and the poet in a way became lost in the Urals. His letters were heavily censored, and very little of his writing made it out of camp. There's a letter to his son telling him to be honest, keep the mistress happy. But there's really little left for Kostash to interact with. Hence, there's, I think, little left to romanticize. So no italics. Which now I think brings the biggest question of all. Is this creative nonfiction? The book this piece is from is classified as a memoir. In Kostash's words, she was convinced by her publisher, saying it would be easier for it to be placed, given that it was such a multifaceted piece. However, given our discussion around memoirs, Drunk Mom, does this stack up in your opinion? Is this actually a memoir, or was that just for marketing purposes? But yet, I think while reading this, it screams the question, to what extent is this creative nonfiction? I think it also is quietly asking, does it matter? Does it matter what it's classified as at all? I wanted to learn about Vassal Stüss. I wanted to explore the 60s people of Eastern Europe at the forefront of the intellectual resistance. As a student of the world and ultimately a teacher, that has a lot of value to me. And because of that, I'm inclined to say that its classification doesn't necessarily matter. I'm not sure if I agree with classifying it as a memoir. I don't. But I don't disagree with creative nonfiction. I can separate the fact from the creative fiction because of Kostash's use of italics. And I think for me, that is actually enough. Kostash has given me a wonderful history of the Ukrainian poet Vassal Stüss, and used really font styles to mix in the creative fiction that, to me, gives the history so much life. Font. Who knew? There's got to be other examples out there, I think, like this. What are they? What else uses font like this to separate fact from fiction, or internal thoughts from external thoughts? I'd love to hear your assessment of that as well. Does anyone know of anything? I'd love some recommendations. So as you can see, I think there's so much to talk about with this article, and I think there's also a lot to have fun with too. I've given you a lot of thoughts, and now, of course, I'm curious as to what are yours. I asked a lot of questions throughout, so I'll really quickly summarize them for you here, and of course, I will post them to the discussion board. But some, creative fun. What are your thoughts on historical fiction? What brought history to life for you? Where would you insert yourself to history? I'd also love to hear your thoughts on the whole fairy tale Mistress of the Copper Mountain, whether or not this is actually creative nonfiction, let alone memoir. There's lots to unpack here. Feel free to rewind, check the forum, and I'll be happy to have tons of conversations with you guys throughout, and I look forward to your thoughtful comments. Thanks, everyone.